And people are still coming in. But I want to welcome you to this talk that's part of our series called Presenting Work. And in today's event, Ellen Frame will be in conversation with three wonderful photographers. It will be Kat Shannon, Chloe Scout Nix, and Emile Kees. And they'll be talking about family as subject. Thank you all for joining today. I'm Anja from StrudelmediaLive. For those of you who are new to us, we offer live online photography classes. We organize photo talks. We have a scholarship program, and you can also watch past talks on our YouTube channel. I want to briefly tell you about some of the upcoming courses. Our classes are for small groups, and so we usually only accept about 8 students for each class. We have a technical course coming up where you can learn to create collages in Photoshop, and they will be taught by Lavon Hall, and it starts next week. We are welcoming a new teacher this summer, Peter Garfield, and he will teach creative color photography techniques, exercises, and approaches. And there'll also be a class with Nestor Perez Molière, and he will teach a class on exploring the botanical world through photography. We will also have a history class with Dortje Fink. She's based in Berlin. And the class is called What Makes a Photograph Documentary? And I'm especially excited to let you know that all speakers in today's event teach for StrudelmediaLive. Ellen Frame has 2 classes coming up starting in the middle of June, and both classes are called The Life You're In, The Joy and Pathos of Autobiography. And both of Ellen's courses are by admission, so if you would like to apply, send us some examples of your work and a short statement, and you can find more information about that on the website. And then Kat Shannon, another speaker today, she will be teaching a class, a mini workshop soon on June 1st, and it's called Still and Moving Images. And our mini workshops are only $39. They're only about 1 hour long. And Kat also teaches for us a class called Ways of Seeing and Photography as Pilgrimage, and also combining poetry with photography. And then Chloe, who is here today, has taught a class called Photographing Intimacy, Photographing Relationships, and she will teach again in the fall or in the winter. And I'm also excited that Emile is here today. He is new to StrudelmediaLive, and he will teach his first with us. He will teach his first class with us in the fall, and it will be a class on photography and writing. Yeah, so also I want to tell you about a scholarship that we have coming up, actually 3 scholarships. They will be mentoring. So if you apply for this open call, you'll receive 3 mentoring sessions with one of our teachers. Stay tuned for that open call. Yeah, now I want to welcome our speakers again, Ellen Frame, Kat Shannon, Chloe Scout Nix, and Emile Kees. And I will put each person's bio into the chat. If you have questions, put them also into the chat, please. And you can also unmute. At the end, we will do a Q&A. And the talk will be about 75 minutes. And yeah, I want to now hand it over to Ellen Frame. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, Anja and Edward. So great to be here, and thanks everybody for coming. I know so many people who are on here today. It's really exciting to be with you. Since Anja is gonna post our bios in the chats just to save time, I'm gonna go right ahead and share my screen and talk first about Darrel Ellis. So, many of you know that I've had a long relationship with the work of Darrel Ellis. He was a close friend in his lifetime. We met in 1981. He died in 1992, and subsequently I stored his work for about 30 years until um, it's taken off in the last few years. He's represented by the gallery Candice Mady. There was a museum show that toured from Baltimore to the Bronx Museum to Milwaukee in South Carolina. Um, he thought of himself as a painter, but he also worked experimentally in photography. And somehow, in thinking about photography, it was especially important for him to be experimental, pushing processes and discovering layers um, through those experimentations. Um, his father was murdered by the police in the Bronx 2 months before he was born, and he grew up with a stepfather. Um, he had two older siblings, and then he had two half siblings after his mother remarried. He was quite precocious. Um, After high school, he studied at SVA for about a year, and then he was invited into the Whitney Independent Study Program for a year, and he had studios at PS1 for 2 years in the late 70s before the Whitney program. Um, but a very important thing happened in 1981, which is that he found some old matted prints by his father, who had had a portrait studio in the Bronx in the late 40s, early 50s. His wife was his retoucher, but then he closed it and became a postal clerk. But he still participated in camera club exhibitions and events. And Darrel found a number of these matted photographs and started drawing from them. And he really didn't know at that time how extensively involved his father was with photography. But one day his mother presented him with this trove of his father's negatives from the 1950s. And the ones he was most interested in were the family images, which were typically not ones that he competed with and exhibited through the camera clubs, but ones that he made for himself and for the family. And both he and his wife had extended family in New York. So there were a lot of family occasions. So as soon as Darrel found that work, he started drawing from just the contact sheets. And then he would make some prints at a darkroom, but he was not that into the darkroom. So he could work from a very small contact sheet image. Um, you can see here a silk screen that he made in the mid 80s, a few years after he'd found his father's work and had gone through it and decided which images he wanted to work with. Um, and here's the silkscreen of the photograph by his father, Thomas Ellis, on the right, and then his version of it on the left. I think the thing um, to realize about him is how valuable the whole concept of repetition was. Um, in the end, he really chose a small number of the many images that his father made to work from, and he repeated um, those images through different media, from silk screens like this to drawing, painting. But he would arrive at the kind of experimental treatment through photograph, usually, like as in this one. So what he's doing here is projecting one of his father's negatives of his Darrel's uncle, and he's projecting it. He did this onto the floor and onto the wall over sculptural forms that would distort the image, and then he would rephotograph it so that everything was in the negative, in the capture. He would rephotograph it with slide film, so he would have a positive, but then he would, in making prints, make an internegative and go back into get a negative and make a print. As interesting as they were as photographs, he was never content to stop there. And I think that's one of the big lessons for me in his work is the depth of his commitment to particular images, taking them through these variations and versions. It makes me think of a painter like Monet doing a repetitive series of the same subject. And of course, in this one, with that face sort of lowered and singled out in that way in the middle, I mean, it immediately makes you think about what the effect of the experimentation is doing, what the visual image is saying through the distortion. What is the comment on this family imagery? This is, for instance, a photograph his father took of his mother, of Darrel's mother, and then Darrel's experimental version of it, where the part that we want to see is obliterated. And what does that obliteration signify? Here we have a group portrait that the father was in the middle, but he's particularly obscured here. And then in the next one, he's gone. And then this is another example of Darrel's variations and repetitions. It's interesting because even before he discovered his father's work and started experimenting with them, he was already experimenting with this kind of projection and experimentation in photography, even though he, as I said, considered himself a painter. He had gone to a high school in New York for fashion illustration and thought that that's what he would do, but he had a really good drawing teacher who sent him and some other student friends to the Met to draw from the masters. And by the time he was out of high school, he was committed to being a fine artist and availing himself of all the museums and galleries and the whole art scene in New York. But there was always this ambition in photography, especially, to be original, to be experimental. And in the process of it, he really goes so deeply into this kind of limited number of images, just over and over, like thinking of new ways to treat them. For instance, here he's painted on them with I think Marshall oils over the photograph. And then, he goes from that composition arrived at through photography, holding on to the composition, but taking it into a pen and ink drawing. And then here's one, this image he used a lot and did one of his best series with. It's of his great uncle. And this is the photographic experiment. And then this is a pen and ink wash that he made from it. And he continued with this image and took it into um, several different paintings and other variations and gouaches. And it's it's a really, I don't know exactly how this uncle was especially significant to him and why he dwelled on this image particularly, but I think his very best work was actually with this portrait of his great uncle. So I wanted to present this just as a heavily layered kind of treatment of imagery of family. And in his case, appropriating the imagery of someone who had died before he was born gave him a certain distance. And yet he knew all of the people that he was, whose images he was dealing with, but at a later date. So he was also bringing to this work his later knowledge of them because all of the images had been made before he was born. Um, and I think that the complexity of that, the conceptual rigor and depth and those decisions is really phenomenal. I mean, I think just as a photographer, he's definitely one of the most interesting conceptual photographers of the late 20th century. But then he was not just a photographer, also paintings like this, I think, are incredibly evocative. So starting us off today on family, that was Darrel Ellis, and I'll stop sharing now, and we'll go to Kat Shannon. And thank you, Kat, for being here. Kat is speaking to us from Brazil.
Yes. Hi, I'm from Brazil. I'm in Brazil. I'm not from Brazil, but I am currently in Brazil. Yes. Thank you so much, Alan. And thank you, Anya and Edward and Strudel. I'm so grateful to be here. I am going to go ahead and dive right in and start sharing my screen. Hello to all the new faces as well, and to some familiar faces. Nice to see you all again. I am just a little bit sick, and so I'm just also speaking a little bit quietly. Hopefully, you all can still hear me. I will be reading a little bit today. My presentation involves images and text, but I also have the text written out. So if you cannot hear me, hopefully reading along will also help. Go ahead and get started. So I'm going to share an excerpt from something that I've been working on really recently. The past 2 years, I have recently become a new parent, and a lot of the work that I've been making and interested in have been towards my family, thinking about domestic labor, thinking about queer maternity, and thinking about what it means to photograph and write about your family. So I'm going to show a small excerpt of images from this ongoing body of work, which also includes an excerpt of a larger text that I have been working on. The eggs in my ovaries were inside of my mother's ovaries before she was born, which were inside of her mother's ovaries before she was born, and on in a Russian doll of bodies and could be or might be bodies. My daughter, though, came from somewhere else. See glossary for daughter and mother. Daughter, an arrival like boiling water, a watched pot, etc. Something to learn, a replenishing resource, an extension, a separation, an obstacle, an entry, not related to gender or biology, despite what you've been told. Mother, an ebbing flow, something I have, something I am, something I give, something I take, not related to gender or biology, despite what you've been told. Timeline. Before, at 12 years old, I declared to no one if I was not pregnant by the time I was 23, I would adopt my first child. It only occurred to me in adulthood to wonder what parts of myself I chose, what parts I assumed. Now, I think I chose the life I've landed in. After, I look at you and I would rather look at you than all the portraits in the world. Frank O'Hara. Two, if I'm honest, I partially feel like a phony writing about motherhood these days because it is easier than it was. I'm slipping towards ritual and slipping from mystic. Sometimes suffering feels like proof. The less it hurts, the less you notice. See timeline. Three, As a teacher, I remind my students their lives and their voices are worthy of art, regardless of their background or access to fancy equipment. I create lectures that celebrate artists of all varieties who empower the mundane, experience it as magical, and use art in order to examine a life and transform our attention. As an artist, I worry I am uninteresting and that my ideas are mostly wrapping paper, a Russian doll of ideas, or could be, might be ideas. Often I am most happy as an ambivalent pendulum swaying between looking and thinking. As a parent, I feel at my most important when I hear my daughter call for me each morning from her bedroom. She needs me to open the door and keep her alive. See timeline. Timeline. How do you hold what has no frame? My daughter's wooden toy clock stands stuck at 10:10, or do I mean stand still? Yesterday was something like 2% of her whole life. It occurs to me now if a clock won't advance or return, the clock is its own type of picture. A photograph of a broken clock is an infinity mirror. Four. In October of 2000, the artist Annie Wang discovered she was pregnant while in the midst of studying for her PhD in fine art at the University of Brighton. 5. While pregnant, Wang begins a long-standing series of works examining her dual identity of artist and mother, moving the lens towards her growing belly and then her growing son. Early on in this work, she was told, "This autobiographical project is not worth researching, particularly at a PhD level, by a professor in her program. This professor was an artist and a mother." 6. A friend who is also a mother asks me if I think I have escaped the assumed gendered distribution of the domestic labor as a mother because I am in a queer relationship. 7. A friend who is also an artist is hurt when I am behind on a collaborative project because my daughter was sick all week and I had no childcare. 8. 8. In April of 2024, I wrote in a notebook, "Am I a lazy artist? Am I an artist at all if I can only ever see what is right in front?" See timeline. Timeline. An analog clock doesn't care if it's AM or PM. 10:10 is now. Time roulette works something like this. Spin the wooden toy and imagine the future. Now or now plus 2 more years. Now or now plus 3 more years. Now or now plus 4 more years. Now or now plus 3 more years and 10 months. Photography's best trick is the suspending what you can't contain. 8. At the kitchen table, I'm cutting fruit and start to imagine motherhood as an apple core split down the center. I am the mother, I am one half the mother. I divide and then combine. I am the flesh, she is the seed. That's all I have. Just to quickly wrap up, I'll say that this is something that I'm still working on, but something that I'm really interested in my work right now is the combination of imagery and text, and particularly pursuing experimental text, which is why I'm using this sort of poetic form of this numerical listing that I'm doing here, and also dipping into these other forms such as glossaries, timelines, footnotes, etc., to also try to imagine how these kind of unique formats can combine with photography to open up new avenues towards interpretation and meaning. And yeah, so this is a brief introduction, but it was a real pleasure for me to put this together and to be a part of this group. I'll now stop sharing and heed my time, and thank you all so much for participating and watching.
Thanks, Kat. That was really, really great. I feel like we could spend so much time on this text, but we can come back to some of it in the Q&A. So next is Emile Kees, who is coming to us from Edinburgh.
Hello. I'm just going to share my screen. So yeah, it's so nice to be here and to see so many people. And thank you to Anya and Alan for having us here. It's truly an honor. So I'm a Scotland-based photographer and writer and arts educator. And I'm going to be sharing fragments from a project called Meteorites that I started back in 2021 and is, to borrow a phrase from most photographers' vocabulary, ongoing. Yeah, so like many projects, it keeps growing and changing as I find the longer I coexist with these visual remnants from this particular time in my life, the more they're able to situate themselves in a broader context of understanding. So this series basically started as a response at documenting in an attempt to understand the unraveling of a normal life as I knew it, or also as my family knew it, because it was during the year and a half before my father died. So the series is made up of gelatin silver prints, diaristic texts, and archival material. It explores family, sculpture, permanence and impermanence, grief, domestic terrain. Quite often in the project, I photograph negative space, like here on the right. It's a plaster cast mold, and I turned to that sort of ephemera in order to create portraits, I guess, and explore my experience of absence or loss or things that were disappearing during that time. I also photograph spaces for storage, familiar forms, and yeah, so on the right is a photograph of my partner, who I lived with in a mobile home that was on the land that I grew up on, a mobile home being like a caravan or a trailer. So yeah, I lived with my partner in on the land, and along with my older sister and mother, who are pictured on the left, we became primary caregivers for that time for my father, and were, I suppose, tethered to the land that I grew up on. We were faced with daily uncertainty. It was quite a tumultuous time. But in many of the pictures, such as the one on the left, I don't aim to capture portraits as such, but rather an experience that may have gone unnoticed at the time, but is highlighted by our intense proximity, that being synchronicity and repetition. And from this, I began to take note of seemingly insignificant coincidences that were cropping up more frequently than I expected. And so I sort of used that as a motif and explore those things throughout the project. For a while, I only found time to photograph at night, and so began shooting the structures, the animals, and the objects that inhabited our land, which served as a quiet but cathartic act, almost, I suppose, in an attempt to make surreal encounters of the day more tangible. There is an immense amount of stuff on my family's land. My father kept everything he ever owned, every sculpture, every test, every sketchbook, for every month of the year, dating way back to the early 70s, every diary, and it just, the amount that he recorded of his surroundings throughout his life was inspiring. So I, during this time, whilst also looking after him and working at the weekends and shooting at night or sometimes during the day, I spent a large bulk of this time archiving his life's work as a prolific sculptor into boxes and polytunnels, along with the help of my partner and sister and mother. And although I don't think I'll ever see everything, even everything that is currently on the land, over time I'd noticed further repetitions. Photographs that I made resembled pages of sketchbooks that I only found later, such as the horses that we just saw. So inevitably, I have started to include this archival material into the project to demonstrate this relationship. The title of this series, Meteorites, mirrors a name he gave to a marble sculpture series, which is a collection of marble meteorites scattered across the land, our home, which I think, for me, are objects which bear witness to daily domestic occurrences. And now, like Kat, I'm going to read an extract from the project, which describes something that happened on a Friday night in the early 2000s. He gets out of the pickup truck at the end of the driveway, near the garden's white sculptures that are now cloaked in the dark. I walk up and meet him after locking the 5-bar gate, which takes me about 20 seconds on the gravel. It's a warm, clear Friday night, and he has just picked me up from the youth club in the village. Some lights in the house are on, but they do not interrupt. They just glow in the background. When I reach him, we don't talk. We just look up and point out drifting satellites, of which there are many as usual. At moments like this, I think that the land the house stands on could be an island floating through space. Maybe a minute passes, and suddenly something enters the atmosphere. It appears directly above us, and shimmering in silence, it draws a line of bright light all the way down to the horizon before vanishing into oblivion. Without hesitation, or even turning to look at me, my father says he has never in his life seen one with a tail so long before. While we continue to look up in awe, the image of the light still behind our eyes, something unexpected happens. Starting again from directly above us, a new line of light is drawn in exact measure to the last. A coincidence in blazing fire and rock lasting a matter of seconds before, like its predecessor, it too fades into the night. This time, he turns and looks at me. In disbelief, he says that this is something spectacular, and that we will likely never see that happen again, not in these lives. His words stay in the air for longer than the lights did, and so we stay for a moment, bathing in what I've just learned, maybe a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Finally, we go inside and I don't remember what happened next. May 21st, 1966. Dear Editor, on Friday, April 29th, between 1 p.m. and 1:15 p.m., I saw an object in the sky through a 1.5-inch reflector telescope. It was invisible to the naked eye. It lay just right of the sun. It was yellow and had a long tail. The object was constantly changing color. I thought it was a comet, the Great Comet. I wonder if any other fellow astronomer did see or could explain this object. Yours faithfully, T. Hayward, age 13. So that's the last thing, but it's a page from what I assume was cut out of a school book in 1966 that he used to draft a letter before typing it on a typewriter and sending it to an undisclosed magazine. But it was a letter that I or my family found in amongst other things in recent years, and it was written, it was found rather after I wrote the previous text. So I just drew another parallel and I've incorporated small things like that in the project. But that is all I have to share for now.
Fascinating, Emile. Thank you so much. And I'm sure there'll be some questions about that material. And now Chloe Scout Nix.
Hi. Cool. Yeah, hi everybody. I want to extend what everyone said so far. So lovely to be here. So happy so many of you are here. Very excited, very happy, very lovely. Yeah, so my name is Chloe Scout Nix. I wanted to start out with this lovely photo of me as a child, which I think was taken directly after I got hit in the face with a snowball. But yeah, I'm gonna talk through some of my work and kind of how I'm thinking about these various ideas of family. Yeah, so my practices primarily consist of photography, moving image, and writing, but today I'm really only going to talk about some photographs that I've been making over the past 2 years. My process is focused on various modes of performing for the camera, which often result in self-portraiture, or kind of what I like to call self-portraiture +1, which this is a photo of me and my mom to kind of showcase that. And I really feel interested in kind of what gestures and interactions have the power to express, kind of instead of what an expression on a subject's face can express. And then often kind of in my photographs that don't involve myself as subject, I like to photograph my parents as well. And it was kind of interesting putting together this series of images to share with everybody, because I don't know, when thinking about this discussion and ideas of family within my own work, there's really something I find kind of otherworldly about family, like kind of these people who are part of each other and are all flawed and have such influence on each other constantly. I grew up in a fairly small town in Texas, and then grew up in a less small town in Texas as well, which kind of had its own otherworldly qualities to work with as well. Yeah, I feel really interested in using people in my family as material, and interested in exploring these kind of strange familial qualities through kind of an abstraction of the body, or dissection of the body, or shifting the point of view to almost change how we're looking at my family members and then creating this almost landscape or kind of, I think that really is just, I feel odd about it and I want my images to almost reflect this odd feeling I'm constantly having. But I explore a lot of family structures in my work and usually try to shape shift the narrative of my own life and the figures in my own life in a playful way. This is an example of an image of me and my father. Um, and in my work, I refer to my father as my twin. So it's kind of an ongoing series that I've been making with him where I view him as my twin. And that kind of stems from kind of the closeness in our relationship, but also just the fact that I look a lot like him. And, you know, being a child and being a young girl and being constantly told you look like your father, I feel like that kind of like left a long lasting impression on me. And it's also like a strange way in which I feel like we age alongside each other. Like I just turned 30 years old. My father just turned 70. When I'm 31, he'll be 71. Our birthdays are like 8 days apart. Like there's been just like a lovely little progression of how we age and how much I see of myself in him. And then I also see my future in him. And so we've kind of created this lovely little like back and forth of, you know, what it can mean to be a twin and to change that kind of narrative of your family in a more playful way. Click. There we go. This is another example of kind of the father-daughter twins of us both. He is just barely kind of seen in the shadow over here, kind of mimicking my pose as well. Thinking of the gestures as opposed to the expression, kind of the strangeness and dissection that I'm constantly thinking about when I'm thinking of also architecture of the space within my work and life, really. I'm also examining and exploring where personal desires and taste for intimacy comes from and how it can be kind of taught to us through the images and media we take in. My avenue for exploring those thoughts are done on a very personal level, really focusing on my own personal desires for closeness in the various relationships in my life, or even in kind of rethinking and reshaping kind of memories from childhood or young adulthood. Most of my influence comes from films and the way film mimics real life and mimics gestures of intimacy that I kind of feel like have such a power over me as a person and a power over kind of how I frame my work, but also frame my life at times. You know, I'm thinking of I'm thinking of Passages, I'm thinking of Baby Girl, of Eraserhead, of Evil Dead, After Sun, Iron Claw, Society, and Schenectady, New York are kind of the ones that are currently orbiting my brain at the moment. And in kind of taking these influences from film and this idea of mimicking and this idea of shape shifting, I explore this idea of the stand-in a lot, using people as stand-ins for my siblings or exes, or shifting the relationships of my family members to be something else, kind of like I like to do with my father. And even now, I feel like I'm kind of directly casting people as my family. So this is somebody who is a friend of mine, but she is now my sister in photographs. And she's been kind of now designated to, you are my sister. In my photographs, you're my sister. And that's how I'm exploring these topics with you instead of my actual sister that I actually have in real life, which I think is kind of a way for me to explore more freely, but also, you know, in thinking of this idea of even like protection or like what should be shared, what should not be shared. You know, I think I
I like the idea of working with strangers because it does kind of separate these very personal narratives I'm working with, like away from the actual people that maybe they're referencing. The domestic space is also kind of a huge character in my work and has a lot of influence on the construction of my images. I'm interested in the domestic space and how it kind of, I feel like I'm someone who the home has been like a big weight in my life and a priority in my life. And since kind of moving to New York and having to build a new home, I think I'm thinking about it even more. And I kind of think about the home as a character in my work, not necessarily in a specific way, but kind of throughout all these homes I'm photographing in, whether it be my home, my family's home, my friend's home, strangers' home that I'm working with, like it all just kind of merges together and creates just this idea of home without it having to actually be the specific home, the specific place, recognizable. Like it's more of the feeling and idea that I feel like that structure brings to me. And I think it's also a space that allows me to choreograph these bodies and gestures and really, think about how this room was actually structured a very specific way for my body and someone else's body to exist within. And I like thinking about that and both feeding into it and then also like sometimes trying to disrupt it as a way of doing that, making it odd, highlighting as a way to break it down, or, just merging and morphing with the space around me as like this scene or performance for my work. Yeah, I talked through all of the things. I think that's everything I have for you right now. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chloe. That was great. Family is such an ancient topic for writing, for painting, for art. Um, it's it's interesting how it didn't find its legitimacy really in fine art photography until, the last 50 years, I would say. I mean, there were formal family studio portraits and things like that, of course, from the beginning. But anyway, it's so interesting to think about all of your approaches. And now I want to ask questions that you can all respond to. I was thinking, in terms of Darrel Ellis, about how he had such a fraught relationship with family. I mean, his father being killed by the police, growing up with a stepfather who was abusive, being the only gay child of 5 siblings, the only artist in the family. And it made me think that maybe it was artists who had serious problematics to explore with their families who wind up actually making work on that subject. But then hearing from all of you, you all, I think, in different ways contradict that. Even if some of the experience that you've had, like Emile's, were, serious and troubling, but I get the impression from all of you that of these close and deep, meaningful family relationships. So I'm just wondering how you might think about that, about the thing that needs to be resolved or explored that drives you into this subject. And just whoever wants to go first, feel free.
It's a good point, but I don't think it's inevitable. But I do think it can be an outlet, a form of therapy, by making work about something that by making work about something you meditate on it endlessly.
Yeah.
And in some cases it can provide some resolve. But personally, when I make something, a photograph or a written text, I can sometimes feel like I'm physically putting a feeling or an emotion or an experience down into that thing. And so I can see the correlation between, artist and pain, pain, but also like yeah, familial issues. Yeah, I do get on
Were
very
there,
well.
you'd get on very well. But Emile, in your case, you mentioned your partner being there through that time with your father.
Mm.
Was there ever a time when it was confronting to your family to accept your partner
No.
or to accept your own identification?
Mm, mm, we no, I don't think so. It was we have a very close relationship, me and my family members, and initially, I mean, growing up it was just the five of us, and my two siblings and my parents and me. Um, there was a rupture during my childhood which caused our entire extended family to be somewhat severed from us. Um, and so we grew up not really understanding why, but we grew up then on the proviso that it was just us. And so then one day when one of the pillars disappears or falls, it caused all of us to unravel. But by that time, we had brought in extra people, like partners or whatever, and they were immediately accepted. And yeah, I mean, I never had a very direct conversation about like sexuality with my parents. I mean, they're both artists and teachers, and uh, yeah, and I don't, we, yeah, never had that specific moment. It was more like that conversation and the conversation of trust and um, truth was weaved into the fabric of our relationship rather than being one verbal exchange, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think I diverted away from your question.
No, that was totally relevant.
Yeah, I really like this question because it makes me think, what is the reason we make work about family? Which is surprisingly really difficult to answer. I think even as a person who makes work about my family, it's hard to sort of find the source that drives the work. I think for me, and for I think a lot of people, photography is a way of my own sort of engagement with the world. It's sort of the lens through the literal lens, but also the sort of metaphorical lens through which I can kind of consider, participate, and engage with my environment and my feelings. And so I think in my situation, I'm so, and for so many of us, I'm so deep in family, I'm doing the dishes and I'm doing the laundry and I'm parenting and I'm just thinking a lot about this identity that I have on, and using my camera and also through forms of, combining images and writing. I think it's my process for kind of engaging with that world that I've built around me and sort of understanding it, sharing it, processing it, breaking it down.
I mean, in a way, like the way that you describe it, it's like, you're incredibly busy with those obligations and responsibilities. But so how could you find something, to work on as an artist outside of that? So the access to the subject, it's being around you, of course, is makes it easier in one sense, but in another sense, there's a danger that it all becomes too familiar and you take it for granted and you don't see it as something to work with or with questions and mysteries. So that then I think finding the way to have some distance on it is the challenge, maybe. And that's kind of the opposite of the way probably a lot of photographers, you know, choose their subjects. It starts usually, I think, with a kind of distance, and then it gradually they become closer and closer and part of what they're photographing. But in your case, we're talking about the opposite, and so that factor of distance, or you know, or how do you pull back in those circumstances?
Yeah, it's interesting. It is a very interesting question, and it's kind of a way of like, I don't know, I feel like for me, especially like with my family, where it's like a lot of my work I'm thinking about myself, like it's all myself kind of that I'm stemming from. And a lot of myself has been built and shaped by my upbringing. And I think there was like a certain point in even just the last few years where it's kind of like, humans are such flawed creatures. And the fact that such flawed creatures then have children and then those become flawed and maybe even inherit flaws. Like it's such an interesting like way of just like existing that I think I'm so fascinated by it now that like I almost feel addicted to those thoughts and to that subject matter. And I think even just from growing up in Texas with my family, like some of my life was I was homeschooled, like it was quite like a small experience there. That now I'm the only member of my family that lives outside of Texas, essentially. Like I'm the furthest away from my family. And I think it kind of took me leaving to then be like, oh, that's all really interesting. And I really enjoy thinking and exploring that. And like, there's so much pain there, and there's so much happiness, and there's so much weirdness. And I think, it's been an interesting process to examine that with distance. And then now, I only have opportunities to photograph my family when I'm in town, which is like very far and in between. And so I think that's also where my kind of like search for these figures in my life and these different subjects that I can almost like cipher into my family structure kind of come from. I don't know if that directly answers that, but that's kind of what I've been marinating on.
Yeah, I mean, you showed us examples of working with surrogates, like friends as
Hmm.
surrogates, or even strangers as surrogates for family members. And I'm wondering when you do that, um, is does something shift because you don't care about them as much? I mean, that way in which they're projected as those people you care about, but then they're not. And so there's not the same dynamic going on. Or do you find that distance that it brings, I don't know, enables a flood of projection?
Yeah, it's it's kind of been, I think, in specifically when I'm thinking of like the surrogates I've used for people in my family, there's almost like a healing, comforting quality to it because I think, especially with my siblings and me being the youngest sibling, like I have a lot of resentment towards my siblings just because they were older and mean to me. And so now when I can kind of explore this idea of what if there was like softness and comfort and good, nice things that I can experience with my siblings, but it's kind of through someone who isn't my sibling. Like it's kind of a mix of emotions where it's like it's kind of nice and cathartic and almost healing. And then when it stops, it's almost like, oh, nothing's real actually that I'm doing. So it's kind of like it's a bit of a back and forth on how that feels, but ultimately it's good. It's like photography is, it's like getting stuff off your chest, getting stuff off your back. Like it can make you feel a little lighter, I think.
In a way, the subject of family, the experience of family is so universal and so familiar in a way that like maybe, like Kat gave us that example of someone who wanted to make work about her direct experience of motherhood, was it? And the advisor said, no, you can't do that, blah, blah, blah. So there's this familiarity with it, but all of you actually gave us this sense of, I mean, Chloe, you even used the word otherworldly, but there was that sense of strangeness, uncanniness, otherworldliness. I mean, Emile talking about this like UFO kind of experience. I mean, throughout all of your presentations, there was this like not necessarily mystical, but like really um odd
Mm.
uncanniness, I guess. And I don't think we usually think about that in connection with the subject of family, unless we're talking about deceased family members as ghosts, etc. But what do you think about the appearance of that in the work, that mystery?
I love that question. I mean, it makes me think too what you were asking earlier about the sort of problem with distance of how do we work with the material that maybe we almost know too intimately, and then approach it with some kind of perspective that is both maybe interesting but also kind of evergreen or fresh. And I think perhaps what I'm hoping to do with my pictures, and I think certainly Chloe and Emile are doing really well as well, is attempting to look at my experience and my family from a more sort of poetic sort of shifting or abstraction. And I think that also helps me with some of the work of distancing. I think attempting to use my camera and making a picture to sort of inch at the margins of how it feels to be a parent or how it feels to be a partner, how it feels to live in a family structure, whatever that might look like for a person. And sort of find those places that are kind of in between the vernacular quotidian that actually end up maybe pinpointing to something a lot more challenging or richer. And I think that's the challenge as an artist is how do I make pictures that are doing that? But also how do I work with the pictures? I think for me also a lot of it is becoming about sequencing and writing and kind of using them as material and allowing them to kind of take on a different ecosystem beyond just the moment that shutter is released, but in the form of how it is kind of presented in whatever context that is.
Recently, I was meeting with a student who, and I got this strong impression that in this program that he was in, he was, he was putting a big emphasis on originality. Like to be cool was to be like really fresh, almost beyond comprehension, like, a subject like family would be like way too traditional and familiar for him. And yet that was his subject and some work that he wasn't sharing, but was gorgeous actually. And then I realized that no, it's not that the work is too traditional. It's that there are all of those taboos about exposing one's family that are daunting. That's the thing I think that keeps people away from it the most is like, who are you going to upset? Who are you going to be accountable to? Who's going to question your, right to do this, your authority, etc. And that will even go to your whole role in the family and what it has been and how it's been undermined in the past. And yes, Chloe, I hear you. I'm a youngest child too. So I'm curious to hear you talk about those taboos that may have existed for you and in developing this work. Those obstacles and considerations about what's allowable and what you have to say or what you can get away with saying.
Yeah. I think that's like definitely a really relevant question that I feel like comes up a lot when people are photographing their family of kind of like this idea of not wanting to take advantage of them just because they are your family. I think for myself, kind of how I mean, my parents have always been very supportive of my art practice, so they're always, there's never been any pushback in me working with them. Um, but I think it's kind of like a couple things I think about of like one of them being like, in my opinion, like photography is kind of an abrasive and sometimes rude art form just by nature sometimes. And I think and almost like accepting that and accepting how straightforward it can be, that helps me kind of get past the like, it's not really me doing it, but I am participating in this thing that has kind of a greater context than I maybe thinking about in my small world kind of vision. And I think also photographing my family or any of my subjects that I'm personally interacting with in front of the camera, I know that I am somebody who will always put myself in the more precarious position. Like I'm always the one who is more naked or the one that's more perceived. My face is maybe shown more. My body's being pinched or squeezed, or I'm dipped, or my hair's being pulled. I think I try to be very conscious of like that dynamic, and so that I'm being always perceived more than whoever I'm photographing with. And that is almost kind of my way of feeling more comfortable doing it. It's maybe not the most way of like self-preservation on my end, but I think in thinking of just how to make sure I'm not taking advantage or being kind of gross in a certain way, that's always how I've kind of thought about that for myself.
Great. Anybody else?
I'm the middle child.
I mean, Emile,
So
I was thinking about you, starting this project when your father was ill and everyone's pitching in and everyone's concerned. But, I remember starting a video about my father 2 weeks before he died at home. And, that question of what's permissible and whether this seems exploitative. And in my immediate family, nobody ever acted like it was exploitative, but when I was doing it at the funeral, my cousins all gave me these dirty looks.
mm, God. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine. I think I wanted to. I usually in those situations of precarity or extremity, I do want to photograph the thing that everyone's like, focused on or looking at or wants to know, rather than the edges or the periphery, which I tend to steer towards. But I didn't feel like I was in a position to ask that, mostly because I didn't trust that even if I did ask and I was granted permission, I would capture what I aimed to capture. And I'm not really a portrait photographer anyway. So I do steer towards photographing scenes or spaces or ephemera that represent a person rather than their face or their physical condition. And so I sort of, I guess, trained myself to say more about the imprint that someone leaves behind with an image of a plaster cast mold rather than their portrait, because I don't think I'm as well versed in portraiture anyway. However, I did mean it when I say I'm a middle child, so I have developed a sort of observational complex and a mediator. So maybe that's just in my nature as well.
And then, I'm also thinking that because you're all writing in some capacity and like then writing can be even more revealing than photographs. And so, Kat, when you're combining them, it's like this, I think this double sensitivity about what the taboos around that are, like what's being said.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm always thinking about the ethics of photography, especially as it relates to making work about someone else, especially in my situation, about making work with someone who doesn't have the capacity to consent to it yet. I think it's a really important conversation and one that I'm always wanting to have. I do think it's a little risky to make your own, to create a scale of what is sort of permissible in your work based on someone else's parameters. So whenever someone asks me this question about my work or about theirs, I'm always, a hedge to sort of say what they should do, because I think it's actually a sort of personal negotiation and conversation. You need to create the boundaries around your own work that feel safe and appropriate for you. I think for me, I try to continuously reevaluate the work and ensure that it's coming from a perspective that is distinctively my own, and that in the photographs I make and the writing that I do, I'm not making assumptions around my daughter's identity, hopefully, or personhood, but I'm sort of anchoring myself and my experience as the author, and creating work that comes from that sort of position. But it's tricky. I mean, somebody wrote in the chat about, putting in pictures of faces and things. I think about my daughter's body and how much of that I want to be put into the internet, which is, this ether of kind of endless nothing, right? Every picture can go anywhere. And so I'm careful about it and thoughtful about it and want to think about it and rethink about it, while also try to avoid the impulse to let it muzzle me too much, and let it can sort of be an element that moves forward as I make the work. I kind of do so in tandem. But you're right too, that I think that the writing can sometimes be even more vulnerable, even though it can maybe appear physically like there's less at stake. Sometimes there's actually much more happening there.
And then we have to remember that, whatever we write or photograph has not been released yet. So we always have control over that, and the editing and the stage of release and the context of release. So that I think sometimes, I'll call it sketching towards something is a good thing, and harmless, at least more or less, until, you structure it and decide what the form is and how it's going to be shared. And you have a lot of time in which to make those decisions. But I think better to do the sketching than to be bottled up and, and constrain it all until you figure it out, because it might take a long time to figure it out. Exactly. But
we should soon, sorry to
yeah,
interrupt you, should soon
we should
open
go to the questions. Yes.
Q&A, right?
Yes.
Is that okay with you, Alan? Okay.
Yes.
Edward, you may read the first question.
Yes, the first one is from Alex, and it's a question for Emile, wondering about the veil, the covering of people and objects in some of your pictures. Can you tell us more about that? And then a question for everyone, wondering about your thoughts on portraying or not, showing or not the faces, identities of your families or significant others.
Cool. Yeah, the veiling. So for a while it was incidental, I feel like the very first image of the plant under the curtain that just happened to be the sort of the sheer curtain in the caravan that I was living in, and I woke up one morning and it was covering it in such a way, and I photographed it because I liked how it looked, and then maybe started adopting it into other instances to sort of echo that effect, the sort of sculptural black and white effect. But having dwelt on it more, and also to echo something that Chloe just said about distance and the breathing space that is required for retrospective analysis, it could be deemed metaphorical, that like in any family there's going to be miscommunication and information that is veiled and phrased differently to different people. And so maybe I started to pick it up a bit more and weave it into other instances. Thanks for the question.
And then there was this question to everyone, wondering about the thoughts, your thoughts on portraying or not, showing or not the faces, identities of your families or significant others. Whoever would like to pick up that is fine.
Let me just say, I get tired of faces, direct photo, portraits with a lot of faces. And so I really appreciate it when photographers figure out other ways to evoke personality, character, through gesture, through the body, through the relationship of the figure to the room, to objects, all of those things, which, and including text, which I think everyone here is doing in interesting ways.
Actually, Alan, while you were there, there's a question for you, based on or about Darrel Ellis's work and the relationship with his family. Based on what you know about his life and work, do you think his redacting or fragmenting of family members' faces might have been a projection of his own experience?
Definitely, and his emotion about that experience. I think it says a lot about absence and his anger and resentment, or the fact that he didn't have an experience of his father because he was needlessly, I mean, he was, arrested over a minor traffic incident and then killed on the way to the precinct. It was a brutal thing. And all that robbed him of in terms of an experience with the one artist who preceded him and his family. Also, I think it's that redaction, there's so much in it. Also, it's also about his experience in, the family that he grew up with, the stepfather, etc. And then also I think it's a way of dealing with inherent aspects of sentimentality and work about like family portraiture, etc. Is that, you take away something like the face, the central part of a portrait, and you ask people to look at other tensions in the construction of the work and look at it differently. And I think he was all about trying to create a unique experience, and apprehending the work. So thanks for that question, Hillary. And thanks for being here.
Here's a question from Valeria. As a photographer working on a family-centered project, I sometimes wonder how relevant the work of one person focused on a very small circle of individuals, their beliefs, values, and lived experience can be to a broad audience today. Is it possible for the most personal experience to become a universal message?
I'll quickly jump in because this is something I think about a lot as well. And I think I also sort of got close to writing about a little bit in my text of feeling like my photographs are maybe uninteresting because they're so sort of personal and generic. I think something that a former mentor of mine said to me when I expressed this before was that essentially that question is another way of asking, like, is my life as it currently is in this current position, like good enough, interesting enough? And then it becomes about like interesting enough for who, right? Like, this is the life you have, this is where you are. And I think there's always value in making work about where you are, who you are. And I, speaking for myself, am really almost particularly interested in work that is quite personal and sometimes approaches more of that sort of mundane, really banal parts of existence. I think can actually be quite magical and transformative. And so I think feeling that way is a really natural impulse that I absolutely relate to, but I think it's our jobs as artists to resist it and follow our own intuition into making the work about, our very small group of personal people or everyday life, because I think there is still value in that.
Yeah, kind of jumping off that, I totally agree. And I think, I've had this same thought since everything is kind of about me and my work. But I think, as a human and as like an artist, I do feel so drawn to people who are making work that, they're just allowing themselves to be vulnerable and allowing themselves to like say and talk about what they're feeling or thinking, or, even if it's not directly shown like on the front of an image or a work of art, like it's so interesting to have access to just what they're thinking and feeling, even if I don't, it might not make it like universal, but it still targets an audience and targets emotions and feelings within people. And I think, that's such a positive and like welcoming experience. And I think it's also like in art, and I feel this way all the time, even with my writing or my photographs, where I feel like we can sometimes be taught that everything has to be kind of drowned in metaphor or pulled back from what we're actually thinking or wanting to talk about. And I think that's a habit I'm trying to kind of break, where it's like, well, actually, I want to talk about this thing that I'm directly feeling, and I want to talk about it even if none of you are feeling it. And I feel like that's kind of been my motto of like, I'm just talking, I'm saying what I'm feeling, I'm putting it out there. And, you know, that's kind of half the reward of making the work, honestly.
And when we say work about family, I think we have to acknowledge that, you know, the subject matter defined that way is just like a pretext for subtext and other subjects layered within it, you know. So you use the family as models, or you reference the family, you reference a familial experience, but the work may be more accurately described as being about this, that, or the other thing, you know. It just, I think there's such an intensity about all of our experiences with family that it is a good, it's a provocative field to enter, from which to riff into other subjects.
One more
One
question,
more, okay.
because we're, you know, kind of going over a little bit already.
Actually, a question from Noah, and maybe he'd just like to unmute and ask.
Ah,
Oh God.
Hello, I didn't expect that. Sorry, my question was just so I'm Emile's partner, and one of the things I've noticed in the process of hearing everyone talk about this is that I was sort of thrust into a very intimate and personal situation very suddenly, which is not common, especially as Brits who don't like to share their feelings. Is not common to happen. And I was sort of welcomed into this family at a very vulnerable time. And I was wondering about what other photographers felt about sharing that idea of intimacy and emotional closeness, which maybe only exists within a family group in a very specific way with a broader audience. Like, how do you convey that to other people? But also, how do you feel, I suppose, ethically about sharing the insider sort of track of how a family works?
thanks for that question, Noah.
I'll let the others field this first.
I feel uncomfy. I mean, it's hard. Like I think it's draining and it's hard and it kind of takes a toll on you. I think I try to come for the perspective of like, you know, anytime maybe I'm airing out the laundry of my family or past relationships or feelings or, you know, kind of anything that I feel like I've kept in and haven't shared on just like personal human levels. Like it's very scary, but I think I always am approaching it from this idea of like, I'm making this work, I'm writing these stories. I'm not looking for an apology. I'm not looking to fix things. I'm kind of just responding in my own time and way to all of these situations. And I kind of have to, at least for me, just approach it in that way and hope for the best, honestly. Like I do feel horrified by people seeing my work and reading my work and especially people who the work is about. Like it's a horrifying feeling that I don't quite know how to unhorrify for myself, but I'm kind of persevering through it. So that's not really a fix for that, but just know that I feel horrified half the time I'm showing work.
Do you mean like trusting yourself, Chloe?
Yeah, like I just have to, you know, you can't just keep everything in. Like even if it is like painful or secret or, you know, never been spoken about, I think there's a point where it's just like, I don't know, as an artist, like it kind of has to release itself and you have to kind of work through then other people perceiving it. which is the scary part, is just being perceived for what you're experiencing and feeling.
Yeah, I really relate to that. I like what you had to say, Chloe, too, about the work is not like demanding anything. I think that's true sometimes with my work as well. It's often about presenting sort of questions and ambivalence. And I'm hoping for there to be space for abstraction and interpretation. It is challenging because to make work that's personal and vulnerable, you put yourself in a position to be judged and sometimes worse, misunderstood, which is really difficult. Also, because I think in my situation, I'm making work that's really personal, but it's also a very small slice of, a much larger life, There's many things that I don't make photographs of or write about. And so it's also difficult to reconcile, I think, the sort of missing pieces to sometimes an audience or observers who want to sort of see it as an entire piece. I think I really love too what Alan had to say about family pictures and home pictures can also sometimes be an entry point into maybe like a vortex into something else. That's something I'm going to be thinking about, and something that I think is useful for me when I'm making the work too, is that I try to remember that it's not only about one thing, but it's ultimately many things simultaneously. And I think that helps me as I move through it, both in kind of shape shifting it and letting it grow, but also freeing myself, I guess, liberating myself from the chains of being weighed down into one piece of it, allowing myself to kind of grow from it too.
Well, thank you for all of your very full and generous remarks. And it's really been delightful to spend this time with all of you. I just love the work that you make and the writing that you're doing. And happy that we could all be together today. And also big thanks to all of you who joined us, and Anya and Edward as well.
Thank you, Alan.
You, Alan.
Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited that we had this talk today with 4 of our StrudelmediaLive teachers. So, yeah, let's stay in touch. And if you could sign off, if you still have questions, if you want to say hi, you can stay. But yeah, thanks for being here. I appreciate